Stitchery, fiber art. What is fiber art? Fibers are yarn or thread, and quilting, stitchery, and weaving are examples of fiber art. Here are some student examples of stitchery and burlap. Some of them are filled in more than others. All of them are outlined with different color yarns. To begin, you need to start with a piece of burlap with a simple drawing on the burlap. Choose some yarn that you want to begin with and cut it to about the height of your body. One end is going to be put into a needle and the other end will have a knot. The eye of the needle is the opening in the needle. This yarn has to go through that little opening. To make that happen, here's what we do. Threading the needle. You can't just shove the end of the yarn through the eye in the needle because it tends to separate into lots of little fibers. So bend the yarn around the needle. Pull out the needle and you've got this nice little bend between your fingers. Wiggle the bend through and then pull the yarn through the eye of the needle. You're going to let it overlap about 6 inches. Don't tie a knot around the needle. Save the knot for the other end. Tie a knot at the end away from the needle. Here's a simple way to make a knot. Make a loop, put the tail through the loop, and then pull. Pull gently so you have a nice big thick knot instead of a tiny little knot. Now you're ready to start stitching. Take your needle and you're going to always start from the back side of the burlap. Poke it through on your line. This time you're going to pull it all the way through until that big knot catches on the back. Now I'm going to make a stitch that's about 1 inch in length and then scoop up some burlap that's also about 1 inch in length. Pull the yarn with your hand so you don't pull off the needle. This is called the back stitch, so you're going to go back to where you came from. Go back in the exact same hole that the first stitch ended in, and then scoop up some burlap and pop out ahead by 1 inch from where the yarn was. As I pull this with my hands, I can see the 2 stitches are now touching each other. I back stitch back to where I came from, and then poke it out about 1 inch ahead. You're not always going to use 1 inch as your measurement. If you've got a straight line, 1 inch is great. If you've got a tight curvy line, you might need to do a 1/2 inch or even smaller. Continue going back to where you left off and popping the needle through 1 inch ahead. Try not to get the yarn tangled up when you pull it, and if you do, you might have to just pull out your stitches. Continue on in this fashion until you cover the line with no spaces between your stitches. That's the great part about the back stitch. There's no spaces between the stitches. I'm going to show you another stitch now that does leave a little space. I'm going to have to tie a knot to end this back stitch, so I flip it over when my yarn is on the back, like this. Make a loop. Put the needle through the loop and pull it, but I like to hold my loop with my fingers so it stays really close to the burlap. Pull, 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 and now you've got a tight little knot right next to the burlap so you can trim the extra yarn off with a pair of scissors. And now continue on. This time I want to show a different stitch. Let me start by tying a new knot on my black thread. I loop it, put the tail through the circle, and pull gently. Let me teach you about the running stitch. This stitch is very easy, but it does leave a little space between every stitch. Start from the back like always so your knot stays on the back. Scoop up some burlap, but this time only 1 fiber of burlap. That's all you get to scoop up. And you're going to pull it forward so you see the black yarn on top for 1 inch, and then it goes under for 1 string of burlap. Make another inch stitch and scoop up 1 string of burlap. Pull again and continue just like this, making stitches that only have 1 fiber of burlap between them. If you pick up more than 1 fiber, it doesn't look very good having large spaces between your stitches. You might want to poke it into your finger and then curve it back up again. It doesn't hurt because these needles are very blunt. I'll continue on this line for a while, picking up only 1 fiber every inch. Pull it by the yarn so you don't pull your needle off. Now I'm about to head another direction. I need to bring the needle to the front of the burlap and then make my 1 inch stitch, scooping up 1 fiber. Many students complain that the yarn comes off the needle every time they pull. Here's a great tip. Hold the needle by the eye so the yarn won't slip out. Remember how to thread it, bend it, wiggle it, help it, and then overlap. Pull it by the eye of the needle, and that will keep the yarn from slipping out. Pull it by the needle, and it always slips out. Practice that. Remember, the back stitch leaves no spaces between your stitches. The running stitch leaves a little space between your stitches. Let's learn about the fill-in stitch. I'm threading my needle 1 more time. Bend it tightly around the needle. Wiggle the bent part through the eye, and then help it with your fingers. Let it overlap near the needle, and put a knot at the far end. Here's a little trick for making a knot. I'm going to just wrap it around my finger and then roll it off my finger, causing it to flip itself inside out, and when I pull, I end up with a little knot. That's a fun thing to practice. Here's where I'm going to fill in. The bunny's tail. Here are some examples of the fill-in stitch done by students. Picture a bunch of vertical lines side by side, filling in the tail. That's what I'm going to do with the yarn. I'm going to go from bottom to top, and then from top to bottom. So I'm going to poke it through the back of the burlap. So I got to wrap my needle around, come back up from the back side, and now another vertical stripe will go right beside the first one. So they're all parallel, they're all vertical, side by side, and they always start at the same end where they ended. So if I went in at the bottom, I'm going to pop it out at the bottom. Right now, I'm going to go in at the top of the tail. So guess where I'm going to come out? From the top of the tail. Watch. Right there. I'm going to put another stripe that goes to the bottom of the tail. And then from the back side of the burlap, I'm going to pop back out from the bottom of the tail. So you go from bottom to top, top to bottom, bottom to top, top to bottom. This keeps all your stitches parallel and doesn't waste any of the yarn on the back of the burlap where no one's going to see it. When you start running low on yarn and it looks like your yarn is about to be doubled over, pull a little bit more out of the needle so you only are overlapping 1 inch or 2 inches. You've got to be careful not to pull it out of the needle, but that will give you a little more yarn to work with so you can finish off your fill-in stitch. I think I've got 1 more skinny space to go. Right there. Do you remember what we have to do when we're finished with that yarn? Turn it over, Ooh, look at that. I didn't waste any yarn in the tail on the back. Tie a knot. You always want to end with a knot on the back. Make a loop, put the needle through the circle, and pull it while you're holding onto the knot. Keep the knot as close to the burlap as possible, and then trim it with a pair of scissors on the other side of the knot. You're done. Now you've got the back stitch, the running stitch, and the fill-in stitch. Let's have you give it a try. Good luck.